Fujitora is pissed off in this week's episode of One Piece. At the end of this review, check out my quick-fire review of the anime series The Rolling Girls, Episode 6. Highlight of the episode for me, personally, was anything that involved Fujitora. He's basically the Zatoichi, the one-eyed, badass samurai swordsman of the One Piece series. And at the end of this week's episode, he's getting ready to have a battle with Zoro, which is absolutely perfect, because they're both swordsmen, and I think that's something that we all want to see. But this week's episode was very simple. Basically just more of the same, seeing the destruction of Dressrosa, all the citizens killing each other, getting tied up by the Marines, but there's still little things they do with it that I actually kind of like. Ironically, one of my favorite things about this week's episode, which is probably one of the most minuscule things, is I actually really liked the animation of the leaf going through the blades of the birdcage. I thought that was really clever just to show how absolutely sharp it is. But some other big developments about this week's episode is that Law is still handcuffed, and this is going to lead to a lot of really funny scenes because Luffy is just running around with Zoro and with Law in tow, still handcuffed by the way, and Violet apparently is going to try and find the keys to the cuffs, but that doesn't even happen in this week's episode. And it's funny, I don't even think Luffy planned for like his big flashy entrance in front of Doflamingo's goons to be that badass when he had Law on his shoulder with the sword and everything, because he seemed pretty shocked and he was like, oh crap, we need to get the hell out of here. Another highlight of this week's episode is getting to see Koala do some fishman karate. She's actually investigating some of the boats looking for weapons for the Revolutionary Army when suddenly she learns the boat she's about to be on is about to be burned to the friggin' ground, so she decides to lay waste to some fools with some amazing choreography and probably the best action part of this week's episode. And frankly, it's just fun to see anything from either her or Sabo because they're a part of the series that's still pretty mysterious. But again, anything that involves Fujitora in this week's episode is okay in my book. I especially love how he has his own code, his set of ethics. That's why he's not going after Doflamingo quite yet. And Doflamingo is just going to throw him right under the bus. He's going to use him, and then he's just going to kill him, which that's a confrontation I just love to see because you can just feel Fujitora's rage in this week's episode, especially when he walks up in that scene where he literally towers over everyone. That scene is very intimidating. Dude barely even says a word. Cut to to be continued screen. So what's the rundown on this week's episode of One Piece? It was a pretty good episode. It was a little slow in some parts, but there are some shining scenes. I loved the koala scene. Anything with them, like I said, I think is really interesting. But I also really like the scene where Luffy, Zoro, and Law were trying to run away from Doflamingo's goons like Senor Pink, Dellinger, and even Vice, who was constantly trying to crush him, which left massive impacts in the ground, which I actually thought was pretty cool. And I like how Zoro actually just tripped up Dellinger by like lightly kicking him on the back, and he ended up kicking Vice, who was still in his 10-ton form, so he ended up hurting himself and Vice at the same time. It was a pretty funny scene, and then of course that's when Fujitora comes in and you're just like, oh yeah, this guy right here. Oh, it's gonna be badass. And people who read the manga obviously know what this is leading to. And if you guys look at the preview for next week's episode, it's literally going to be earth-shattering because Pika is finally going to go on the attack. And this is an episode I've been waiting for a long time. Just to hear his voice will be amazing. At the end of the day, this was a pretty decent episode of One Piece. Really slow in some parts, and the animation and artwork was a little wonky at times, and there was a little bit of overuse of some flashbacks we frankly just didn't need to see, but this still had some shining moments that you check out if you're a fan of the series. A little bit of action, you get to see Doflamingo being an evil villain as he usually is, and of course there's the prospect of frickin' Fujitora showing up at the end and being a badass. So I think this was a good setup episode, not perfect. So I'm going to give this week's episode a 3 out of 5. Just an average episode of One Piece, but one that you should check out if you've been following the anime version or you're a fan of the One Piece manga series. Thank you guys for watching my review. If you liked the video, please hit the like button. And before you guys go, please tell me what you thought about this week's episode of One Piece. Did you have any favorite scenes, favorite action scenes? What are you hoping to see in the rest of the Dressrosa arc? And remember guys, you can also subscribe to our channel by clicking on the channel button up here and follow us on social media like Facebook and on Twitter. Now stay tuned for my quick fire review of The Rolling Girls, Episode 6. Holy Shachihoko, this week's episode of The Rolling Girls was pretty good. However, I have to admit, they have not captured the spirit of the first two episodes, which were completely laced with a lot of action scenes and beautiful fighting choreography, and now they are simply laced with drag queens wearing fried shrimp hats and bowls of noodles. This week's episode was still a lot of fun because we got to see the rival gangs having a big race at the end of this week's episode. Himeko, the main girl of this two-parter, actually decided to get over her fears and decides that she likes building giant wooden golden fish that go at the top of pagodas. But you're gonna forget all about that at the end of this week's episode, which featured an intense race scene between the vice captain and Dandy. But not exactly Space Dandy, a dandy guy in space. That would be awesome. This is actually the old guy from the coffee shop, and he is joined by his protege, who ends up winning the race at the end of this week's episode, where both of the Shochi Hakos go up at the top of the pagoda and represent everybody in this state. Everybody seems to like them, and everybody is at peace. Thus, the Rolling Girls have accomplished another mission of bringing people together, and oddly enough, Chihaya did not turn into an octopus again. That's pretty freaking weird. What I will say is, this week's episode was pretty good. I would still like more action scenes and a little more from Shigeo and Matcha Green, who I imagine have probably just fallen off the edge of the series at this point. Despite that, this week's episode was gorgeous and very nice to look at as usual, especially that final race scene, especially with the hand-drawn animation at the end, and that song, Train, Train, is going to get stuck in your head. So, this was a pretty good episode. However, it's still not quite the show that I was hoping for. However, if anything, it's absolutely gorgeous, it's absolutely adorable, and it features a girl who randomly turns into an octopus. Seriously, watch the other episodes.